I want to get started now that it's a couple minutes after 5.
Sure.
And welcome everyone who's joined us this afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to give you the opportunity to preview a really spectacular and moving film called Oh Mercy, and to hear from several people who are working to end the crisis at the US-Mexico border. Today, we'll get a chance to hear from Sister Norma Pimentel, who's a longstanding advocate for migrants along the border and who was recently honored as one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people of 2020. We also have Robert Bilheimer, an Academy Award nominated director of the Oh Mercy film, Dr. Susan Bissell, former chief of child protection at UNICEF, and Ned Flanagan, a student at the University of Virginia who's been actively engaged in volunteering along the border. So before we see the preview and hear from our guests, I wanted to do 3 things. Briefly tell you a little about how this border crisis came about, mention why it matters, particularly for children, and then go over how our discussion can work. We're excited to give you the chance to ask questions of our panelists. So the film Oh Mercy tells the story of thousands of refugees and asylum seekers clustered in a camp in Matamoros, Mexico, which is located right across the Rio Grande River from Brownsville, Texas. So how did this makeshift refugee camp crop up on the doorstep of the United States? A Trump administration policy forced people arriving at our border seeking asylum from persecution in their home countries, which is a right afforded to them by international law, to instead of coming into our country and waiting safely, to wait in Mexico instead for the entirety of their legal case. And this wait was not a few days or a few weeks. This wait has been more than a year for many people with no end in sight. Crowded together in hundreds of tattered tents, the kind that you would use for a weekend camping, people are waiting without sufficient food or clean water, without health services, without school for their kids. And as Bob was mentioning before we started, conditions are rapidly deteriorating due to COVID-19 and increasing gang violence. While the numbers have been decreasing some in the camp, the conditions remain horrendous and people's hope is eroding. I've been working on this issue through the Humanitarian Collaborative at the University of Virginia and through a group called Project Adelante, with support from Bruce Springsteen and others, many of you who are joining us now, so thank you. I've been to the camp several times and last year conducted a study to learn more about the experience of parents and children living there. And the children have experienced and are continuing to experience severe trauma. And we know that this can cause long-term damage, literally changing the circuitry of their brains, which affects their health, behavior, and learning for a lifetime. The policies our country has imposed are crippling a generation of children. We're lucky today to have panelists who know the camp well, who understand the impacts on children, and know how to address these challenges. After the film, we'll be hearing from each of them briefly, and then we'll have time for you to ask questions. The way you can ask questions is using the Q&A function at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. You can add your questions anytime, and if you'd like a specific person to respond, you can start with their name, as there's already an example in the Q&A, and otherwise I'll direct them to the different panelists. So I will now pass it over to Millie, and we will begin the film, the preview of the film.
Preview of the film.
The moment I walk into the camp, the very first thing they told me when I saw the children with their faces full of tears, looking up to me with saying, "Sácame de aquí, please get me out of here."
Every year there's hundreds of people that die just trying to come across their southern border. And they die of dehydration in the deserts, and they die trying to cross the river. It's all just to come here. The risk of life for so little doesn't, it's senseless. It's senseless. And we really need a humane immigration policy here in the States.
You know, I have heard families say at some point that they're just gonna throw themselves in the river. They're so desperate because they know they can't go back home. I know I can't go back home because I know we will be killed. My faith is part of who I am. It has allowed me to be able to be a voice to those who are hurting. What I see is that we're not addressing immigration policy to address immigration policy. It's almost as if to address a political agenda. And that's so unfair. We're talking about people, women and children, human beings.
Meet me on the matter motors, meet me on the matter motors, meet me on the matter motors banks.
Each program that they create to keep the immigrant out, one is worse than the other. They're in worse conditions than they were back home.
We have all the answers to how we can fix this. All we need is people to listen because we can handle this, but we don't want to.
I am part of it. I form part of our U.S. response, you know, and I don't think we're doing the right thing. It's wrong and it's immoral. You know, it's up to us.
Thank you. I've been to the camp many times and it's still really moving to see those images and see those children and families. Sister Norma, thank you so much for joining us today. We learned a bit about the camp in the preview. Can you tell us more about what it's like there now?
Well, it's about people that are struggling, that are hopeful, and that are desperate to find a space where they can be safe. And they they feel like they're invisible because it doesn't seem like nobody's hearing them, even though we're trying to speak for them. It's almost as if it goes to deaf ears, you know, because nothing is happening, and they've been there over a year. And as much as we go there to be present with them, to show our solidarity with them by the fact that we care and take them things that are essential just to exist, you know, water, food, you know, things that they need, you know, ways to handle all the mosquitoes and the rats and this. It's not what they need. What they need is to be in the United States where they feel they will be safe, you know, and if anything, they're willing to put up with whatever it is, as long as they can be where they think they will be safe, and that's here in the U.S. And so it's so there's a bittersweet kind of feeling when you are there at the camp, because you see their sorrow, their pain, their tears, but at the same time you see how they come together as one community, and so many different countries, and sharing and caring for one another, and just enjoying each other's company and support, you know. And so I truly do enjoy being part when I get a chance to go across and to be with them and sit down and just chat and talk and laugh and cry and eat. And then when it's time, it's starting to get late, I say, well, I think I have to go. And they say, no se vaya, por favor. Please don't go. You know, there's something there that pulls me and says, I want to stay here. And I wish I had an answer for them other than my presence, because I think my presence helps them. But I think what they need is for all of us in the United States to provide for them a safe passage to be okay, especially because of the children. You know, I think every single parent there, I see them crying for their child and say, if only my child can be saved. It doesn't matter about me. It's my child. I wish my child has a chance. So that's what I see every day. And it's sad to see that it continues to go on with no response to that reality that we're seeing today.
Thank you. What are your hopes for the future for the camp community, and what do you think is realistic to hope for?
The only thing that can be realistic is for it not to exist, and that we here in the United States can take responsibility, and the National Guard, the National Red Cross should be addressing this here in the US side. We would definitely make sure they're safe and that they're protected and that they can go through a process that is humane and due process to determine whether they have a right to be here or not. You know, there has to be a better answer than that. My hopes is that nobody has to leave their country, that the United States takes part more in an initiative to resolve the situation they're facing, because these families would rather be home. They want, and they can't. They really can't be home. And so until all nations come together and find ways to allow people to live in peace in their own country, we're going to continue to see this, you know, no matter how many walls we put up, you know, we have a right to look for life and to be safe. And so that's what these families are doing. And so for the future, I hope we can truly learn how to honor the human family, respect life.
Thank you, Sister Norma. I'm sure many of the listeners will have more questions for you. I want to move on now to Robert. Beautiful film. I know you have a lot more footage and we'll be developing a 10-minute version of this and then hopefully a longer version. You were talking at the beginning about how there are crises all over the world and you've worked in different places. How did you decide to tell this story?
Historically, the work that we do is global in nature, number one. And number two, we try to come to, you know, these issues as early on as we possibly can before they get worse. A good example is the film we made about the global AIDS epidemic. The Gates Foundation in the early aughts gave us $1 million to make the first film ever about global AIDS at a time when it was still perceived as being a gay man's disease or an African disease or this or that. The same thing applied to our film on human trafficking when it was even 5-6 years ago seen to be, you know, about sexual trafficking rather than about the reality of modern day slavery. So this was kind of a no-brainer for us in that it was very clear to us that we have a disaster in the making here with the global response and the global realities of COVID-19. And we saw a lot of historical parallels, for instance, between what happened in South Africa with the AIDS epidemic and the kinds of things that are happening now in terms of our response policy-wise. So that, you know, it was just very clearly something that fit into what historically we've tried to do. And the only other thing I'll say on that is that Oh Mercy is part of a series of films about the global refugee crisis. It's the first of 3 or 4 But we felt we should, we should start with the reality on our own border, for sure, and take it from there.
It sounds like the response has been quite impressive so far, with this just being, even just the preview being released yesterday.
Yeah, we've been rather stunned. I think a lot of this may have to do with the inspirational quality of what the things Sister Norma says. And if you're a filmmaker, you do look for conduits for your message, and otherwise it just all gets rather depressing rather quickly. So I rely rather heavily on the extraordinary humanity and spirituality of Sister Norma. And I think, a lot of the way this work evolves will be seen to a degree through her eyes.
Yeah. What was most, or what is still, as you're making this, most important for you to convey in the film?
I think the suffering, for sure, the historical parallels with other responses to great human rights events and crises around the world. I think the long-term dangers, if this goes, if we don't deal with, this kind of xenophobia and isolationism and nativism that's emerging, whether we see it on our southern border or whether we see it with ethnic hatred against the Rohingya in Cox's Bazar. These are global problems against hundreds of millions of people on the move against their will. And that says a lot, I think, about the kind of world we will or won't live in the future, and hence a great sense of urgency to start to, cut into this and unpack it and help people understand what's going on.
Thank you. I think it will certainly do that. Susan, turning to you, thanks for joining us. I spoke briefly at the beginning, and we saw in the preview that children are facing extreme adversity in the camp. This is layered upon struggles that they've faced in their home countries and on their journey to the border. Coming from your expertise in child protection, can you talk to us a little bit about what can be done for children in these circumstances?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Hi, Sister, and hi, Bob. And this picks up a little bit on what you asked, Bob, in terms of sort of why drawn to this subject and so on. And I think I'm supporting Bob and his small team in this effort to make these series of films because, and I think Sister Norma embodies this, but it doesn't have to be this way. And I wanted to start by saying that because there are solutions, and Sister Norma's touched on this, there are big systemic solutions, and we know what they are. We need to address climate change, we need to address war, we need to address inequity, famine, violence, et cetera, in home countries. And so there's a moral side to this, which is answerable. I mean, and then there's a practical side that's very answerable. And when it comes to children, and then, you touched about my background, I mean, I've been looking for the last 30 years at the safety and security of the world's children. And thankfully in 2016, a number of child-focused agencies came together around the world, and they work here in the United States, in my home country of Canada, around the world, in Bangladesh and other places. And they agreed that there are some fundamental principles that need to guide us as we work with children in these kinds of circumstances. And what really kind of gets me quite emotional, in a good way, I think, it excites me to want to support Bob more, but it is that these agencies agreed, and these were people behind, these are human beings making these decisions. And they said, looking at the international legal frameworks and principles that govern us and so on, we have to agree among everything that's important that children have a right not to be separated from their parents, their families, and their caregivers unless it's in their best interest. And I can't for the life of me, just on this particular piece on Oh Mercy, see what is in the best interest of any child, man, woman, or child to be separated from their family. And so when it comes to kids, there are some really basic things that can and should and have to be done if you're going to comply with international legal frameworks. But if you're just going to be true to who you are as a human being, it's common sense, that we need to, there needs to be some attention to healthcare, to, so medical needs, to some kind of provisional education system, to be staying in your family unit. I mean, I've heard people talking about, and maybe you've been witness to this, Sister Norma, about seeing children actually taken out of the hands of a parent. And that just, it doesn't compute for me either as a professional in this field or as a human being or as a parent. For that matter. So there are plenty of things that can and should be done for children and families, which, I mean, and that's what attracted me again to Bob's portrayal of what Sister Norma is doing on a, daily basis, which is providing some recognition of the humanity of the people that are involved here and trying to help. It doesn't have to be this way is kind of where I land at the end of the day.
And so, what are some immediate things you think can be done beyond the sort of systemic change in home countries, or, clearly ending the migrant protection protocol, or Remain in Mexico, which is keeping people in this camp, but while children are living in the conditions of the camp currently?
Well, I mean, obviously those conditions need to change. We need to figure out, and God bless everybody who's on the front lines trying to reunite and continuing to reunite families. But we need to fix that while this bigger structural stuff gets worked on. We need to be sure that kids are safe. And we know that's not the case from reports that have come out. So, and just basic needs. I think even in the short term, there are ways of maybe Lucy, this is your area too, in terms of looking at psychology and how, how do elders in the community help, how do extended family, but we need to somehow, I think, and this is to Bob's film, we need to let people know that we care. And I even know this from my own work around the world in different countries, but just knowing that there are people out there that are, I'm sure Sister Norma, every time you come into that camp, I mean, there's some joy in knowing that the rest of the world, this story has to be told. And, we want people to care at the end of the day. And so for kids in the short term, I'd say it's, security, it's food, it's being with family and extended caregivers. It's everything we would want for our own children, albeit in a maybe ideally short-term situation. And then I just, if I can, just briefly, I want to pick up on what Sister Norma said about the international community has to come together and create situations of peace at home. And for too long, money has poured through the international community into law enforcement and border control, and not nearly enough into the community-based violence that is taking place, the family-based violence, the things that are drivers, if you will, of populations. And so I think some organizations and governments are getting a better and more sophisticated handle on how they, what do they do to support? How do you help Honduras? What can you do to help El Salvador? What do we really understand about the underlying drivers of people that are fleeing, and how do we address those? And I think all of that will ultimately benefit this generation of children and those to come.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing up kind of, or reiterating the complexity that when people say what can be done, it's so many things, but we need all of them at different, we need things on the ground right away for kids so that they have clean water and food. I'd also emphasize, in my interviews with families, what parents said so much was, our kids are missing out on school. They should have, they would have been in 5th grade now, but they only have learned up to 3rd grade. And how will they succeed in life? How will they ever get a chance? They're behind, they're falling behind, and kids themselves feeling that sense of falling behind. And then really the chance to play and feel, and Sister Norma, you talked about, the joy in the camp, like kids are playing. They aren't playing in a safe place or in conditions that are really healthy, but being able to play and feel like normal kids. And that's really helpful for dealing with trauma and being able to then learn and move on. So we can talk about that more if people have questions. I want to move on to Ned Flanagan, a UVA student. The first question that popped up in the Q&A is perfect segue to what you are going to talk about. People have asked, what can students do? But before you talk about that, I'd love to hear you just let us know kind of what you've done on the border and what moved you to get involved and sort of what you saw.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd just like to start by saying thank you to Sister Norma, Dr. Bissell, and Bob for being with us today. It's really an honor to have the opportunity to hear directly from you all who are working so hard to affect essential change where it's desperately needed. I'm representing the Global Development Organization at UVA, which is an organization dedicated to facilitating conversation, engagement, and direct action among UVA students and professors around issues relating to global development and global inequality. And I'm currently a third year studying public policy and leadership in the Batten School, as well as global development studies and Latin American studies. But these academic interests, aspirations, and goals for my time at UVA were really grounded in experiences that I had during a gap year before I began my first year in 2018. Prior to starting at UVA, I spent roughly half a year working with a binational organization located along the southern border called the Kino Border Initiative. KBA operates in Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Sonora, Mexico. And when working in Nogales, I served asylum seekers and deported migrants in KBI's aid center that's located on the Mexican side of the border, providing meals, toiletries, and other basic necessities to migrants. And then hoping to continue my engagement with work along the border upon coming to UVA, I spent the past 2 spring breaks in McAllen, Texas, through the student group Alternative Spring Break. And although I haven't been directly in Matamoros, last March, I co-led a group of UVA students and worked with World Central Kitchen right across the border in Brownsville to cook meals to be brought across to the encampment in Matamoros. And seeing tray upon tray of food, endless rows of sandwiches, and multiple of these huge 120-quart coolers filled with rice that were to be brought over really provided a glimpse into the magnitude of the need that was present just miles south of where we were preparing the food. And over the past 2 spring breaks, we also worked with a community organization in McAllen, Proyecto Azteca, as well as Sister Norma's own respite center that's operated by Catholic Charities of the Rio Grande Valley. And in March of 2019, 2 springs ago, the respite center was absolutely packed with families and children who were eating, showering, calling loved ones, and respite center staff seemed to be going at a mile a minute. But when we returned this past spring, however, there was really an eerie emptiness in the respite center. Rather than being in the US where meals, clothes, and other resources awaited them at the respite center, hundreds of families were stranded in Matamoros due to the Remain in Mexico policy. And this year-to-year contrast, I think, really starkly highlighted just how much of an impact US policy has had in shaping the situations of the families that are stuck in Matamoros. And in watching the trailer for Oh Mercy for the first time, cinematography and Sister Norma's comments immediately resonated with me and truly convey the realities that exist in Matamoros, Nogales, Ciudad Juarez, and cities across the border, particularly the sheer desperation of the families and individuals fleeing their home countries. Working in Nogales and McAllen, I was and am repeatedly reminded of the true sense of desperation in these people's lives. I can't say I've felt this sheer desperation personally, but it really is the case that people have no choice to return, and because of the current US asylum policy, are left to contemplate just throwing themselves in the river, as Sister Norma explained. Here in Charlottesville, it can be easy to lose sight of this desperation and begin to feel out of touch with the true reality of what's going on. Immigration reform begins to morph into a purely political conversation that seems to represent just another item in comparing political agendas. In doing this, as is the case with other issues, we lose sight of the humanity that's so central to any conversation about immigration. We lose sight of the true desperation present in people's lives and the conditions present in Matamoros and elsewhere. Thankfully, and one of the main reasons I think I'm speaking with you all today is there exist incredible student groups and local organizations dedicated to uplifting the humanity and dignity of immigrant and Latinx communities in Charlottesville, while advocating to transform local, regional, and national immigration policies. Sin Barreras, Creciendo Juntos, the Legal Aid Justice Center's Immigrant Advocacy Program, Madison House's Latinx and Migrant Aid Program are all direct outlets through which to engage with communities and policies that are intimately connected with what's going on in Matamoros. Student groups like Undoc UVA are also at the forefront of championing immigrant rights and advocating for humane change to local and national immigration policy. I think just generally what I hope the community get most is that there exists opportunities to continue to advocate for justice and remain connected with issues like the crisis at the border, even if we might slip into this dangerous sense that the desperation at stake is distant. I hope my testimony and that of the other panelists, along with the film, bring to light the reality of the human suffering that's present all along the border. Recognizing this suffering, though, I think we really need to continue to use our time, energy, and resources here at UVA to take action. And luckily, we have established networks and student groups where we can direct this action.
Thank you, Ned. Thanks for all that you've done and for your thoughtful reflection and the concrete ideas you've given. I think that you're a model for what people can do, and clearly you're living your values by taking the time to work on this issue and sharing it with others. We can now take questions from all of you who are listening. I know we have a range of people. Some of you have been working closely on this issue. Others of you are interested in trying to learn more. So please feel free to type your questions into the chat, whether they are for a specific panelist or for us to discuss broadly. And I'll read one of the first questions that we have, which for all of us. Question is, how do you see the crisis changing, say 6 months or a year from now? As the ED of Médecins du Monde, Doctors of the World, which has experience globally with migrants, we're looking at starting a program in collaboration with local partners in Ciudad Juarez and are trying to understand the long-term problems that will need to be addressed, as the near term is a given. So I know it's hard to predict, but would love to hear your thoughts on maybe kind of what would happen in different scenarios with the election, where we might be in 6 months. Sister Norma, do you want to start, or?
Well, I'll try to see what I can say to that. It's hard to determine what's going to be happening. I know the numbers are dramatically going down very much. And so I don't see this camp there in Matamoros for very long if it continues like that. The approach that the governments, just as the US, as the Mexican government have taken, is to kind of tighten up and not allow new refugees entering, being returned back to Mexico from the US, to allow to enter the camp. And or any new refugees arriving to the border, they're not allowed inside the camp. So it's a strategy to try to minimize and to pretend there's not a problem by doing away with it. But it's causing the problem just to spread out, and for us to find it more difficult to reach out, and with our limited resources, try to be there for those with the basic things of survival. And so it's just making it more difficult. The election will have so much to do with the outcome, will determine a lot of things. I think that it's going to be definitely something to deal with a lot, and to try to work with those that are trying to provide a plan of action so that it can be well thought out and that it can not just collapse all in our hands and make it worse. I think we need to all work together to come up with solutions that can address this human reality and this crisis that we are facing in the near future.
Thanks. Another person asked, again, it's kind of looking forward, given the new 6-3 conservative Supreme Court, it's looking likely that MPP, which is the Trump administration policy that forces these migrants to stay in Mexico. So with the new Supreme Court, is looking likely that MPP will be allowed to continue as US law. If it does continue, what are your thoughts on the direction of the crisis? So you're saying already that people are being directed away from the camp, and it may shrink, but it will be more diffuse. How are you seeing how that could continue, and what kind of response, how the response will adapt to that?
you're talking about, I'm not sure your question, is it has to do with the Supreme Court? Is that what you're asking? Well, I'm hopeful that the people that are in the Supreme Court are really have a heart, you know, and if they do, as they claim, that they will respond to the humanity of the reality and not to the political aspect, you know. I'm hopeful, but you never know. I think that we need to definitely help our elected officials, elected Supreme Court, to see what is happening so that they can respond appropriately to what we're seeing and what needs to happen. And so MPP is not the answer. It's wrong, it's immoral, and it's destroying lives, and we cannot be part of that. And so if any judge, Supreme Judge, has the power to change that, I will be praying for that to happen.
Yeah, and we have heard that Biden said that he will end MPP. The question is, I think maybe it was the New York Times piece that came out recently, but ending MPP is one thing, but the devil is in the details. So what will happen? And you know, we know there's already a backlog of cases, and
Right.
with COVID, there, you know, how do you arrange all the cases? So even if MPP is overturned immediately by Biden, which he said he would do if he is elected, there's still kind of a long process.
Right. It needs to be replaced with something just and humane, but a process needs to be established very quickly and something that is well thought out. You know, I find it that if I see a situation, a problem, I address it and I find a solution that works to make it better. I don't think that we're looking for solutions that make it better. And so if they did, they will find solutions, you know?
Thank you. Maybe Susan, this might be a question for you, but it's others can comment, is why are large humanitarian groups not engaged in this crisis?
Yeah.
Well, or why are they not fully, why is this not an official refugee camp officially managed by the United Nations, as are some of the other places that Bob has worked and filmed?
So, you know, these decisions about what is considered, you know, an international humanitarian crisis, et cetera, there's certain criteria that have to be there, and governments have to, you know, acknowledge these things and then allow certain people to, or organizations to do certain things. And so, you know, I think, I think Sister Norma captured it really well. This is sort of invisible. And which is the beauty again of the film project, from my perspective, is making visible the invisible. And these, you know, these people do really exist and so on. But to the short answer to your question is, I think this whole thing has been politicized. Now I'm talking about this specific, not the other bits, you know, the other pieces that Bob is working on, but this one in particular, they probably all are to some extent political. And I think, you know, we're competing for airspace with a lot of stuff that's going on in the world right now. You know, this has been an extraordinary 2-3 years. I also want to just put this in a historic context, if I can. I mean, I remember dealing with this, if you will. I'll come back to the specific, but just to say, in 2012, we had a big insurgence, and I was still living in the US, and we were in child protection and UNICEF very conscious of this influx of unaccompanied minors, not only, but so under a previous US government. So it's not, you know, this isn't sort of political to a party, but, and at that particular point, the heads of state for the contiguous Northern Triangle countries, the United States, and IOM, the International Organization for Migration, UNICEF, UNHCR, we were all invited, you know, to this meeting in Honduras. And the first ladies were there, and this and that. And the idea was to come up with some kind of systemic plan, you know, to address this. Again, put it in historic. This is not new. It's just newly kind of, you know, exploded under very difficult circumstances. And to Sister Norma's point, I mean, we needed a visionary, a planner, someone to sit down and put the pieces of the puzzle together and to really want to find a humane, sustainable solution to what's going on. And that political will just wasn't it just wasn't there. And, you know, we certainly didn't see it from within UNICEF. So I think that part of why this isn't getting the attention it deserves and needs is that it has been politicized, and there really hasn't been this massive outcry, because I think everybody's outcrying about a lot that's going on and a lot of inequity in the world and around them. And so again, this is why, you know, Sister Norma on the ground and Bob with Oh Mercy and the whole film series, this is so important to storytell, to help people to care again about something that's happening, in this case, in their own backyard.
I did want to mention something, thanks Susan, about storytelling and the importance of storytelling in this and other processes. You know, Sister has used the phrase "out of sight, out of mind," right, to describe what's going on, for instance, on our southern border with the folks in the Northern Triangle. And I often say that you can't blame people for what they don't know. And I think that for that reason, the importance of careful, thoughtful storytelling can't be overstated or overestimated. And I would set that apart, if you will, from the cyclical and sometimes fickle nature of mainstream journalism. I had a friend from the BBC, the senior investigative reporter there, who recently was talking to some of his seniors, and he said, well, why aren't we, you know, doing more about, you know, the US-Mexico situation, or the Rohingya situation? And his boss said, well, you know, that's old news, and therefore it isn't news anymore. And I think that it's very important to understand that these things do move in cycles, often fickle ones, as I say, and that's why we personally, as storytellers, as filmmakers, feel a tremendous sense of responsibility at this point to catalyze and mobilize public opinion and public attitude by simply telling the truth, and telling it, however, in a careful and carefully crafted way. And it's the one contribution I think we can make, you know.
I want to say something to what Bob just said. I don't agree with you, Bob, that you can't blame somebody for something they don't know. I think we can and we should hold everybody accountable for not knowing, because it's a reality we choose not to see. You know, it's not that it's not there. It's a very conscious effort not to know. So we're responsible, all of us.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I think it goes to, you know, the climate of the country and the way we think of ourselves. I do agree that a kind of isolationism has set in. And you're right, you know, people, there is that moral responsibility to be more aware of what is happening around you, rather than to isolate yourself. And in that sense, I probably misspoke when I put it just that way. But it is a reality, is that for whatever reason, the awareness isn't there right now, nor is the mobilization.
Well, and Bob, in the film, even at the end, it says a film about who we are. So it's very, I think the film seems to be explicit. And Sister Norma, you mentioned, you know, I play a role in this. And I think that's true. This is, you know, we all have a role to play in knowing what's happening here. I wanted to ask, how much do you think it matters that this is, you know, on the doorstep of the United States? This is not something across the world. I mean, from Brownsville to Matamoros is like walking 2 blocks. I mean, you can throw a stone across the river. So this is right at the edge of our country. Do you think that matters in the motivating people to care, or is it still, doesn't matter, it's still far away?
It's easy to help people if they're across the ocean, right? Because the United States seems to be very caring and out there helping so many countries. But now that it's right in your own yard, you know, in your front door, the response is different, you know, why? It's something we need to challenge ourselves to. Who are we really are, you know? Are we really truly people who care about humanity?
It's a little too close to home, yeah.
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 Yeah. It creates a discomfort that I'm not okay with, you know? And so, you know, I have an experience when we moved the respite center to a location that was pretty close to a residence. And it's almost like, okay, yeah, we believe in what the good work you're doing, sister, but take it somewhere else where we don't have to wake up in the morning and see that, you know, makes me uncomfortable, you know, can't carry on my life like, and enjoy, because my way of life is being questioned by seeing this poverty right in front of me, you know, every day. And so we don't like that.
All right, Sister Norma, there are a number of excellent questions for you here. So I want to give you the chance to answer. So there's one about how much violence from gangs and human trafficking of children and women affects the situation. And kind of related to that, that there have been several protests by the migrants in the encampment and maybe retaliation by officials. So are there ways to think about this to kind of limit retaliation against the migrants?
I don't know exactly what the question is, but anyway, I think that the situation of the unsafety presence of those that can harm the families is very real and very scary. And it's something that they have to deal on a daily basis. Whether your child happens to go to the restroom late at night, the probabilities of her being taken advantage of are almost 100%. And so having to deal with those issues and that reality is pretty scary. Or being someone that you get a gun come at night and they put it in your head and says, if you don't leave the camp within the next hours, you will die and your child will die too. That's the reality that you see and the people there at the camp are experiencing. Can you fix that? The only way you can fix it that I think of is getting those families out of there. You know, it's not the authorities or anybody that can make any changes. You're dealing with an organization that is very bad, and we're not going to make it better by complaining. It's by getting those people out of there because they're not safe.
Thanks. I think another thing that sort of has to do with storytelling is that in some situations we can tell stories about people in situations like this where they seem like the victims and vulnerable, but there is a lot of agency, right? So can you talk about what people in the camp are doing to make their own lives better in terms of providing schooling or being involved in improving the situation? And
yeah, well, you have to make the best of the time, especially for the children, you know, where the parents become the teachers, and through the help of some of the groups from the US, give them the utensils, the pencils, the paper, the schools, and they are having classes there, you know, and that's beautiful to see the children excited about learning, you know, and taking their homework. And it's pouring. I remember one night it was pouring because of the hurricane that we had in the Gulf, and the parents snapped a shot at her little girl doing her homework where outside was pouring, and she had a flashlight, and she said to her mother, "I'm doing my homework, Mom," you know, and it's in the middle of a storm, you know, and barely could see, and you could see it's dark and all the water pouring everywhere, but she was doing her homework, you know, and being able to be there for children is a very special way that parents help each other to make sure that happens, you know, as much as they can.
yeah, and in some of my interviews, some of the women were saying they look out for each other, they organize. kind of a safety watch at night or inviting people into their tents. And then the
Yes.
communities.
That is something that, like, I meet with the women because they're scared. They say, we're the single moms. We're afraid for our kids. So we have our meetings where we says, how can we take care of ourselves so that nothing happens? So let's do a phone tree, or let's find a way how we can, you can run to or hear, and so that nobody's by themselves. And so being there for each other is one way to protect each other.
Yeah. And then another question for you, Sister Norma. Someone asked about your reaction to the preview of the film. How does it feel to be in it? And what do you think of it? They asked about how you
Well, I don't like to see myself anywhere. But what really touches me is I relieve when I see the film. I see myself, what I experience when I walk, when I talk to the families, when I'm there. It really touches very deeply the pain that I feel every time I'm there with the families. And so the film brings that out to me, and I'm present there again. And so it's, I hope everybody sees what I see and what I feel.
Thank you. Someone else has asked about how we try to convince people who may see this reality but not care. And I wonder, Bob, if you have thoughts about sort of where this film is being, how it's being disseminated, and if you think that telling a story in this way with images and music and Glenn Close narrating, if you think that can help reach people who may not have thought about this in such a maybe sympathetic way, or has it become too politicized and we're basically just reaching people who might already believe? Can you unmute yourself, Bob?
Just very briefly, I'm pleased that Sister Norma is so far okay with what we're doing. I think that what we need to do is to cast the net as widely as possible. That's our job, is to humanize what she is seeing and who she herself in fact is. And I'm not saying only Sister. I was about Cindy Johnson and talking about people doing things, that wonderful we have we're laden with packets of drugs every week, there are so many heroic stories, and I think they're by nature inspiring if you know how to tell them and have the right people in them. So our job is really quite simple in that respect. I think we just have to cast the net as widely as we possibly can and make sure as many people see this work and experience the inspiring example of folks like Sister Norma and others, to the best of our ability. And I think we're well on our way. We're pretty pleased with, even after a short time, the kind of overwhelming response we're getting to even this little preview. Thousands and thousands of Facebook postings already in just a very short period of time. So people kind of feel hungry, to, I think, know more. And so that's my answer. We're just going to put it out there as best we can. I think we're off to a good start.
And just to add to what Bob just says, not only hungry to know more, but to know the truth.
Yeah.
Well, you think about, when the news came out about family separation, and it was really something that became, the outrage spread, and it moved beyond being politicized to being, that parents felt, how can this be happening? How can our country be separating children? And so I'm hopeful that your film and your work, Sister, and everything else that people are doing will help move this more towards the family separation situation where there just is broad outrage that how can there be a refugee camp on our border? How can people be stuck in this place with very little support in horrific circumstances that none of us would want our children, our brothers, our sisters, our parents to be living in.
It's a very hard truth, and we're very encouraged by the broad nature of the response we're getting from people of different political persuasions and so forth. It's a deeply human truth, and it really is, who are we, you know? Those are the hard questions we need to ask. And people were saying it's about time that somebody started asking these questions.
And Lucy, can I just to pick up on that, Bob?
Absolutely.
I think one of the challenges, like this, the film project is not like it's a one-off thing, and then there's a product, it's done. This is like steady at it. We have to keep this on the agenda. This is not flavor of the month. You know, we have this issue around protecting children when there's a crisis. So Lucy, you're absolutely right. When the whole cages and kids being separated and all, there was across the board outrage. You're absolutely, there was bipartisan, and again, I'm not American, but I'm following this stuff in terms of the politics. And I don't know if you guys remember that when that baby, the Syrian child who was, and there we have this drowned baby on a beach, and there's outrage, and everybody's attentive for like 48 hours or whatever. There are short-term fixes to what we're talking about here, but there's a longer, steady beating of the drum around being human, the rights of people, children. And I think this is where Bob's model of storytelling, I want to use this very briefly, but the trafficking work, that film was used across the United States. This is not my life. And it and I'm just using the US, but in India, and it's the seeing of this, the conversations that emerge around it, the discussion, public discourse, getting people to talk, so I think that it's not, the film is like the product, but the process, and what Worldwide Documentaries does is provide, it underwrites, for little organizations and advocacy groups to have access to this material so that conversation can continue. And it isn't just we're outraged at 5 minutes that we see on the news, but in fact, this is something that's part of our collective conscious that we want to do something about.
Thank you, Susan. We've come to the end of our hour. I know we could talk for much longer about this, but I wanted to thank Sister Norma, Bob, Susan, and Ned for speaking tonight. Thanks for the beautiful film. Remind everyone, Election Day is a week from now. Your vote can make a big difference in the future of this issue, but not only your vote, it will take concerted focus and effort. The 10-minute Oh Mercy film will be coming out later this fall, and you can go to Worldwide Documentaries and look for that, and it'll be on Facebook, and we can share that. So please stay engaged in this issue, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.